12 minutes past 10, which is 12 past 9 in Queensland and 12 past 7 in WA. Need to SMS tonight? You can. 0467 922 702. 0467 922 702. There are tens of thousands of Australian children who lack a permanent home. Wards of the state or foster children, many of whom will never return to live permanently with their birth parents. And yet pathways to being adopted into a loving home are almost non-existent in most of the country. Australia has rightly turned away from that concept of forced adoptions, yet there are some who argue the rights of the parent and the ideal of keeping a family together have taken priority over what is necessarily best for the child. Last year, New South Wales legislated to adopt open adoption, a higher priority for children who are permanently wards of the state. And tonight we're going to explore what exactly this means, and it's been looked at by other states as well. Our guests are Elizabeth Cox, Senior Manager with Barnardos Australia. Good to see you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Elizabeth. And also with us tonight, Dr Jeremy Sammut, who's a research fellow at the Centre for Independent Studies. The forthcoming book is called The Madness of Australian Child Protection, Why Adoption Will Rescue Underclass Children. Thanks, Jeremy.
Good evening, Tony.
I'll start with you. Why has adoption become such a taboo in most parts of the country? As I said, it's the lowest level since 1968.
Sure. The obvious answer is the legacy of the stolen generation and past forced adoption practices. Adoption has fallen out of favour because of the harm that flawed child protection and adoption practices did to some adopted children and their families. However, the story is more complex than that.
Yeah.
Adoption is rarely used in Australia because over the last 40 years, child protection authorities have embraced the idea of family preservation. What family preservation means is that all efforts are made to keep children with their families, no matter how dysfunctional. When children are finally removed as a last resort, all efforts are then made to reunite them with their families. What family preservation also means is that even when it's clear that children cannot go home safely, severing parental rights through adoption is considered unacceptable, and children can remain in care for all of their childhood.
I've got to say the figure on adoption from the out-of-care system for last year really tells the story. Very few.
It does. Last year there were 43,000 Australian children in out-of-home care. 30,000 of them had been in care for 2 years or longer. Now that's a proxy figure for the number of children who theoretically could be adopted. There were only 89 adoptions from care Australia-wide. 83 of those were in New South Wales alone, so that's 6 in the rest of the country. And six in the rest of the country. And to put the New South Wales figures into perspective, while there were 83 adoptions in New South Wales, there were almost 18,000 children in care. Those figures speak of a chronic underuse of adoption.
Gee. Elizabeth, can you explain open adoption for us?
Okay, so for children being adopted, we have always done open adoption. So we've been an adoption agency for 30 years. And open adoption means that children will continue to have some contact with their birth family. That varies depending on the situation. It also means there's an exchange of information. So as Jeremy said before, there's a legacy left from the forced adoption practices and when things were very secret, but that doesn't happen, and it hasn't ever been the way that we have worked. So children can have supervised contact with their birth family. There may be email exchange, there may be letters written, photographs, and of course information, which is extremely important to children.
Yeah. I think it's not widely known that New South Wales has this open adoption available, and for decades too. So what did the legislative change introduced recently actually mean for open adoption? Did it just formalise it?
Well, I think for as sometimes happens, the practice has often been occurring and then legislation catches up. I mean, since 2000 there has been the Permanency Planning Principles, which set in place some guidelines for making permanent plans for children, whether that be to go home or to live with kin or to come into adoption. So last year's legislative framework means that adoption is actually what we would now say is third on the hierarchy. So it comes in for a child. It must be considered as the third option if going home to either a birth parent or if going to kin is not going to be a safe option for a child. Then adoption must be explored, and if it's not going to be put forward as a plan, then there must be very clear reasons why not.
Why was foster care, the kingpin up until recent times?
Well, look, I think, again, perhaps supporting what Jeremy has said is that there's misunderstanding around adoption. There are concerns that the past practices are not to be repeated, and nobody would want to see those repeated. There's a lot of misinformation and a lack of understanding. And I think the other thing that we would certainly say is that when there's a clash of rights, and parents' rights have often, we would say, taken precedence over children's rights. So it's as Jeremy said, sometimes children are repeatedly sent home when in fact the evidence or the situation that they've been removed from would say to us that that's not at all safe and they shouldn't go home.
The recent Channel 9 series Love Child, did that help? It was pretty scary.
Oh, okay, I'm not so aware of that program.
No, Jeremy, are you aware of it?
No.
No, it just looked at adoption practices in the early days, that sort of 50s, 60s Australia, which was, where the kids basically were taken away from the mother before they even got to see them.
I think that's a really important point to make, that nobody is trying to apologise for past practices. Past practices were based also on the idea that children were blank slates, that they had no previous identity, biological or cultural. And that often led to adopted children basically becoming strangers to themselves. Open adoption is very different. Children maintain contact with their birth parents, they maintain contact with extended family. Part of the responsibility of adoptive parents is to make sure that children realise they have a heritage and a background, and that needs to be nurtured.
This foster care system that has been in place, is it a bit like a revolving door? You're likely to be, part of about 6 different families.
Exactly. It's called, the technical term for it is drift in care, and there's been spates of inquiries in the last 20 years in Australia which have all identified that as a major problem for children. Any parent, any child basically knows that stability, attachment to a carer who loves them and provides the support that children need is crucial to their development. That's what this system doesn't provide. And I would argue it's actually worse than that. It's not just the instability in care. Because of this ideology of family preservation, children are kept in homes where they are exposed to prolonged abuse and neglect. That leads to them having all sorts of emotional, developmental and other problems. When they go into care, their problems are so high, they've got such high needs that it often causes their placements to break down, literally because carers cannot care for them. We're now at the point where it's recognised that virtually all children in care have some level of high needs, and so there's now a push to professionalise the system, basically to have trained professionals who need to care for these children. Look, I think that a system that has to professionalise itself to care for these children is a failed system.
Jeremy, you have to say that if you look at the statistics, the numbers in state care who go on to prison are hugely high.
I think that's exactly right. Children who are in the system end up not only being in jail, they end up being in the homeless service system, they end up being in the mental health system, they end up being in the domestic violence system. What we actually have is a system that perpetuates intergenerational disadvantage and that creates the next generation of dysfunctional parents. Adoption gives children the security, the safety, the homes that they need for life, and that's where it's different to foster care as well. It gives children a permanent home.
Do any other states think that they could look at open adoption, or is it pretty much a one-pit pony at the moment?
similar to what Elizabeth said, the permanency planning laws that have been introduced in New South Wales have also been introduced in Victoria recently, but they left out adoption. It was too hard. It remained in the too hard basket. So what they've introduced is a system of permanent guardianship, whereby foster parents will effectively have parental responsibility for a child until they are aged 18. I think we need to break the taboo on adoption for this reason, that it's not just about changing the laws and having permanency planning regimes. What we need to drive is cultural change within the departments, which are virulently opposed to adoption. What that ultimately means is that adoption has to be considered as a possible option for children from the first response. And that's crucial for the most obvious reasons, that it changes the way that evidence is collected, because ultimately, if parental rights are going to be severed and a child is going to find a new family, that evidence has to be presented in court and convince a judge to make those orders.
Yeah. Elizabeth, what do we know about the importance of children growing up with a strong sense of where they came from, even if they don't live with the birth parents, just knowing their history?
Oh, look, it's very important. And the young people that we speak to that have been through our adoption program, they talk about the value of having access to information. So they talk about that in relation to knowing about their past, knowing about the intricacies of their birth family. And it just actually helps them form part of their identity. So they can also use that information when they're in conversations in their adoptive family. And all of that makes them have they have a sense of wholeness, and it contributes to a really balanced life and a sense of completeness.
What has usually happened with the birth parents for a child who end up in a position where they're a candidate for the open adoption program?
Well, for the children that come into our program, there's been serious child protection issues. So we're talking about families with entrenched drug and alcohol issues. We've got massive episodes of domestic violence. We've got birth mothers who go from one violent partner to another. So these children have been exposed to all of that, and repeatedly. So we're talking about children that have suffered at the hands of very violent people, where they've had broken bones, where there's been instances of, you may know of shaken baby syndrome. So these children can come into care with massive developmental issues because of this abuse, and there is the opportunity for some of that healing to occur, but the sooner it happens, the better.
We've just had an SMS from HH that says, a member of my family's fosters, and I believe it's unfair, as they're certainly willing and able parents wanting to adopt, will only change when former foster kids start to sue the government. I call them almost the denied generation, denied permanent parents.
I think there is a lot of merit in that argument. What we need to realise is that what we are doing in the name of preventing past mistakes is often as damaging for children who were separated, forced adoption in the past. I think we will reach the point at which we have to make another apology to another forgotten, stolen generation, but this time for not intervening, for not removing children from harm's way.
Simon and his partner Wally are fathers of 2 children. One of them has already been adopted under this open adoption provision, and then the process of adopting the second child, who came to them originally as a foster child. And Simon has agreed to have a chat to us tonight about that. Simon, good evening.
Good evening, Tony.
Tell us a little bit about how and why you came to be an adoptive parent.
My partner and I, we started talking about wanting to be a family, and we wanted children as part of that family. We felt that we had a lot of love to offer and a safe and secure home. So we started looking at all the options that were available to us at the time. And about the same time, I guess it was fortuitous, we met an old friend of the party who was working at Barnardos, and started talking to her, and she said in that conversation, you guys would be great parents, you should think about fostering. And when we looked into it, it seemed perfect for us, as if, we'd be able to have a family, but we'd also be providing for a safe and loving environment for a child.
Simon, what sort of process do you go through as far as the filtering is concerned to make sure that you're the right people?
The process is fairly straightforward, but I sit here and I've been listening to all the theory and the statistics and the history of adoption, and everything that's been said is right. But what I keep coming back to is reminding ourselves we're talking about real lives, little people that just want stability and love, and we're talking about little boys like my boys, and you need to do what's right for them. So, but the process was about interviews with Barnardos, a training course, which was great. We met other families in the same situation as us, and we had to do criminal record checks and also those sorts of things. The process wasn't simple, but I don't think it needs to be simple, because it is about changing a life for a child.
Yeah. I mean, were the kids young when you got them, or had they got a few years on the clock?
No, they were both young. They were, our first son was 2, and our second was younger than that. He was about 18 months old.
What's going to be your attitude to birth parents? Is it one of those things where, you have a plan for them to be part of the kid's life, or is that not really even appropriate under these circumstances?
No, living it, I know that it's really important. Like, it's not easy and to make that relationship with the birth family, but it's important to our kids. It's important that they know where they came from, they know their history, they know all the pieces to the puzzle that makes up their life, and it's complicated, but it's their normal. And we talk about it a lot. We talk about our family, and we talk about both of their birth families and their brothers and sisters. They have quite a few, and we list them often, and we laugh about how big our family is, but that's their normal, and that's what they need.
Presumably, you've got 2 kids, 2 different sets of birth parents. You guys have also got your own interconnected relationships as well.
Yeah.
Christmas must be hell.
Yeah, but whose family is it? Like, we're all got complicated families.
Brady Bunch with a twist.
That's it.
What about the open adoption part of the policy? I mean, was that difficult, or was it quite intense?
It would be lying to say it's not intense to start off with. Like, the whole building that relationship with the birth family, but you stick at it because it's what's best for the child, and as long as you're going there and the birth family are going into those situations, and the catch-ups we have, knowing that this is best for the child, and it gets easier over the years. We've with some of our birth family, we've got really good relationships. With others, it's more distant, but it's really, really important for the child.
Had you done some fostering before this, or it was, your first and most successful option?
It was, Barnardos do a really great job in giving you all the information of all the different options you have to support children like this. So you could be a respite carer where you take children on the weekend, or you could be an emergency carer. And we went into it wanting to adopt, so both of our children came to us in a foster care situation, but with the view to adoption. So after the processes had all happened, and is still happening for our second child, the adoption will come.
Are there particular difficulties that have come up because of what's happened to the kids prior to you gaining access to them?
I
suppose they were pretty young anyway, so...
Yeah, well, I think we're fortunate. Our boys were very young. They still required some special love and attention, and being open to what that might mean for them and what their history was, but with lots and lots of love, we're very fortunate that it's been fine.
Yeah. I suppose when you first entered it, you didn't think there was going to be that long-term adoption option, or were you aware that was always a possibility?
We were surprised to find out that it was always a possibility, yeah. Yeah.
Simon, thank you so much for giving some time tonight. Really appreciate it.
No, thank you.
Good luck with it. Jeremy, the elephant in the room here is a bit of a no-go zone, Indigenous kids, with the forced adoptions that did take place up until the 70s. It's still a difficult issue for Indigenous communities.
It is. It's a raw issue. We recognise again that past practices were flawed, that Indigenous children were denied contact with their not only their birth parents, but with their broader Indigenous communities. There was a strong push towards assimilation rather than fostering children's cultural identity. However, I think we need to revisit what we currently do in Indigenous child protection, which is that we try and place children according to the Aboriginal child placement principles. So we try and place them with kin in their local communities. Because the problem with that is that given the high levels of disadvantage and dysfunction in some of those communities, what can often happen is that children are removed from the frying pan the frying pan of their own family's dysfunction and end up in the fire of broader community dysfunction, where they're still vulnerable, still at risk of harm. I think we need to revisit those policies. I think we can do it in a culturally appropriate and sensitive way. And what I've proposed is that if we did decide to introduce Indigenous adoption, what we should have is fund Indigenous organisations to provide cultural support programs so that we can reconcile child welfare with culture and identity.
Elizabeth, do Indigenous adoptions occur through Barnardos, or is that not an area you go to?
No, look, we don't accept Aboriginal children into the Find a Family program. We do recognise that adoption is not part of the Aboriginal culture or their traditional values. So we support the Aboriginal children living with their parents or their kin and community where it's safe to do so, and we, strongly advocate that those communities should be well resourced and, efforts put into making those communities strong for their children.
Obviously we have people from many countries who come to Australia and live and become part of the Australian fabric. Do you try and get cultural sensitivities respected? For example, if somebody came from Pacific Islands, would they be brought in to respect that islander community as well?
Yes, and sometimes we do have other, other cultures coming into our program, and if possible, our first choice would be to recruit a family that is of the same culture for that child, be it Pacific Island or Chinese or whatever. So we do put a fair bit of effort into trying to do that because we recognise how important it is. And there's also a cultural plan that would be prepared for those children. So to make sure that as much as possible we can give that child access to those particular traditions and cultural freedoms that they have.
Jeremy, is it possible, do you think, to see a future where Indigenous kids and also kids from certain communities can be given that option to have a full adoption going forward? It's been sensitive, but it's one of those things where I think perhaps we're going to have to bite the bullet.
Sure. Well, the New South Wales open adoption laws specifically exclude Indigenous children from open adoption, and for the reasons that Elizabeth has mentioned about adoption being seen as an inappropriate practice. Look, I question that, and I question it for a similar reason to what's occurred in the UK, which is that in the UK they've tried to match what's termed black children with black families, which has led to black children in care being adopted at far lower rates. The Cameron government has tried to make some changes around that, dropping what they've called the politically correct requirements to place black children with black families. I wouldn't go as far as to say it's political correctness, but I would say that we need to be aware that if we are condemning Indigenous children to a lesser standard of care in the name of trying to, again, well-meaning intention to prevent past mistakes, what we are actually doing is creating a situation in which we will perpetuate the gaps between the most disadvantaged Indigenous Australians and the rest of the community. So I think we need to be fully aware of what we're doing and why we're doing it, and I think there are alternatives. I think we can have Indigenous adoption so long as children are properly educated about their culture, have continuing contact with their kin and culture.
Elizabeth, part of the difficulty, I guess, is also, we just heard Simon saying that, he got a couple of kids and they were very young, and so therefore, he literally grows up as part of a new family. But what happens when you've got kids in their late primary school, early teens area? I mean, is it possible for them to find a permanent placement, or is that a lot harder?
Look, it is a little bit more harder, but initially when we first started as an adoption agency, we didn't deal with babies, we didn't deal with young children. So our average age at that stage was about 9 years, the average age of adoption. So we are able to find families. There are families out there that actually don't want to have a young child under the age of 5. So they might have raised their own children and they think, well, actually, I've got some more to give and I actually want to open my family up and I'll open my home up to another child, but I'd really like a primary age child. We just need to keep looking. We advertise a lot for families, and every family can provide something different, and we look specifically for different children's needs. So whether that child, and depending on their past and depending on what sort of situation they've come from, will dictate the sort of family that we might match them with.
Do you do things like respite care? In other words, do you provide families who, for example, take kids over the Christmas holidays or something of that ilk, just as a way of providing a bit of extra care for kids?
What we actually do is, so for some of the older children that are in our permanent program or heading towards adoption, those foster carers sometimes do need a little bit of extra support. So we have an internal foster respite program. So we provide respite for our own children who are within Barnardos, because we sometimes see that those families do need that extra support and they may not have their own extended family to call on. So that's how we provide respite.
Jeremy, I think probably a lot of developing Australians need role models as an important part of the mix. And this is quite difficult, obviously, if you've been in that foster care situation, particularly for a number of years. Your associations are constantly fractured. That obviously can be really damaging down the track.
It is, and that's really where you have where the studies have shown that adoption is the superior option for children, because it doesn't just provide a temporary carer, it provides a family for life. One of the things that children report is that they feel more secure because they know that the department can't intervene, that they won't be churned through another family home. They know that the person who puts them to bed is going to be the person who gives them breakfast the next morning. They are not, their schooling is not disrupted. They don't have to start making friends all over again because they've had another move. As I say, I think these are the basics of child rearing. Any parent would know that children need stability in order to thrive, but unfortunately we've got a system that is based around parents' rights, not the best interests of children.
Elizabeth seems to indicate that it's very much harder to place kids after they've reached 8, 9, 10 and beyond. That seems to be the case.
Yes, I'd like to make the point that this argument that there are all these so-called unadoptable children in care, who are these 9, 10-year-olds, what we have to understand is, why are they unadoptable? They're unadoptable because they've been damaged through by being preserved in the family home. Once they're 9 and 10, you're right, they are damaged. It'll be very difficult for a family to adopt them. That's why it's crucial to have permanency laws, not only have permanency laws, but to have them enforced so that we don't endlessly preserve children in families that are damaging, that we make realistic decisions about when it's not safe for children to go home or when they need to find an adoptive family.
Elizabeth, a lot of these issues been in the too hard basket for too long?
Oh, look, I think it's the way we need to put children front and centre, and I think just going back to one of the things that Jeremy mentioned before, children do need families for life. One of the things that happens for our children in the foster care system is that they're very aware that come 18 they may not have somewhere to live. And as a young adolescent, growing up with that thought, it's frightening. And we see it time and time again, where at 15 years of age, they actually think, heck, it's not that long till I'm 18 and nobody's going to be able to tell me where I'm going to go. And that must be so frightening for our children. So what actually happens is that those children actually go about making sure that that placement breaks down before then, because they're very fearful. And another point I'd like to add to what Jeremy has said is that a child might be in foster care and they might have had the message from an adult, no, you can stay here, that's going to be okay. But in fact, one of our young men that was adopted a number of years ago, and he's now about 16, but he said that he used to, despite having a very stable foster care placement, which did lead to adoption, it wasn't until the adoption went through that he actually suddenly relaxed, and he said, I know that no one can actually take me away. When his worker used to visit, he would actually hide. And that's the fear that our kids have, and it's the fear that can be healed through an adoption, because they've got a family saying to them, I want you, I love you, I'm going to look after you forever.
Jeremy, has community services failed a lot of young people simply by not being able to identify kids in trouble early enough?
I don't think that's the case. The children who remain in the system for a long time, in the out-of-home care system, have been known to child protection services for a long time, often from birth in many cases. One of the most significant recent developments is the case of Chloe Valentine in South Australia, where that was the typical circumstance where she died despite her family being reported to the department in South Australia many times, 21 times. But despite that, no action was taken, even though this was a clearly dysfunctional family. This has led the South Australian coroner, Mark Johns, to agree that adoption is underused in Australia and that it should be considered far more often than it is to give children, to rescue children and to keep them safe.
Are people advocating to government for changes to the adoption system? Are they actually encouraging them towards an open adoption policy in more states?
I think the debate has changed. I think there are increasing numbers of people who are prepared to speak out in favour of adoption. They're prepared to say what was once taboo and argue the government should put children's interests first. For example, I talked about the coroner's report before, but there's also been, in recent public inquiries, both in Victoria and in Queensland, the underuse of adoption has been acknowledged and recommendations for the greater use of adoption have been made. And we've also had people like the National Children's Commissioner and the Chief Justice of the Family Court who have both said that adoption is underused. And we need to point out that it's underused compared to countries like the UK and America, which both have flawed child protection and adoption practices, just like we have in Australia, but adoption is much more common in those countries.
Just wondering whether you'd like to join us. Perhaps you have been a foster parent, perhaps you've been in foster care, perhaps you have been a victim of the system in the past, perhaps you've got some inside information on that. If you'd like to talk about it tonight, we'd love to talk to you. Elizabeth Cox is with us, Senior Manager with Barnardos Family Adoption Program, and Dr Jeremy Sammut is also with us tonight from the Centre for Independent Studies, and Jeremy's got a new book coming out very shortly called The Madness of Australian Child Protection, Why Adoption Will Rescue Underclass Children. If you'd like to join us, we'd love to hear from you tonight.
Lines are now open. Call 1300 800 222.
Known for his films, books, and witty sense of humour.
Is this a rhetorical question? No.
Quite right.